Hey guys, today I'll show you a post-apocalyptic horror thriller TV series named The Stand, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama tells about a terrifying virus sweeping across the globe, causing those infected to ooze yellow fluid from their bodies. Within days, their internal organs would decay, leading to death. In just a few months, 97% of the global population perished, leaving countless cities as desolate ghost towns. The origin of this horrifying virus traces back to a biotech research facility in California. One day, a guard received urgent orders from his superiors to immediately lock down the lab. Before the call ended, a researcher appeared outside the guard post, her limbs and facial features dripping with yellow fluid. Realizing the severity of the situation, the guard quickly activated the lockdown switch, but the gate was jammed by something. Thinking of his family inside the facility, he seized the chance to escape, waking his sleeping wife and children and driving them away from the research site. However, as they reached a small town of Texas, the car swerved and crashed into a gas station. The attendant, Stu, rushed to the vehicle only to find the guard's face covered in yellow fluid. With his final breath, the guard urged Stu to seal the town before succumbing to death, while the guard's wife and children had already passed away. Days later, an outbreak struck the town. Many victims collapsed and died on the spot. Despite the deployment of full cleanup crews, they couldn't keep up with the death toll. The military quickly quarantined the entire state of Texas, while Stu was isolated in a military research facility. A doctor approached Stu, explaining that the fleeing guard had carried the highly infectious virus all the way from California to Texas. Everyone who had contact with him had died, except for Stu, who was the sole survivor. The doctor speculated that Stu's body might contain antibodies. With over 80% of the population in both states infected, the doctor pleaded for Stu's cooperation in researching a cure. Stu agreed to assist the military. The next morning, the doctor hurriedly informed Stu that a nurse's son at the base had been infected and the facility could fall at any moment. They needed to transfer him to a safer location. Before Stu could process the situation, he found himself on a military vehicle. It was then that he learned they were headed to the Atlanta headquarters. The journey was uneventful, and they soon arrived at their destination. The doctor explained that this base, located several hundred meters underground, had enough supplies to sustain life for millions of years. Relieved, Stu sighed deeply, unaware of what had become of the outside world. That night, Stu had a strange dream, finding himself inexplicably in a cornfield. As he ran frantically, a wolf with glowing red eyes suddenly appeared, only for him to be jolted awake by the voice of the same doctor. Looking frail and coughing, the doctor grimly confessed that he too was now infected, and the vaccine research had been completely abandoned. Panic set in for Stu, causing him to wonder how he could escape from a facility 26 levels underground. The doctor revealed that only the commander had clearance to unlock the exits. As they spoke, an infected agent burst into the room, his mission being to eliminate Stu. The doctor stepped forward, and using his bullet-attractive muscles, took a fatal bullet for him. Stu grabbed a scalpel and slashed the agent's chicken throat. As the room filled with the voice of the base commander, Stu was instructed to follow the lights for guidance. Before long, he reached the command center and came face to face with the commander. On the monitors, the entire city was shown to be overrun. The old commander, despondent, revealed that the order to assassinate Stu hadn't come from him. Clearly, someone high up didn't want the antibody carrier to survive. It was ironic that this facility, built to withstand 5,000 tons of explosives, couldn't defend itself against a microscopic virus. The commander granted Stu clearance to leave, urging him to assist in medical research to ensure the survival of humanity. As Stu walked out of the control room, the commander shot himself without hesitation. Navigating corridors strewn with corpses, Stu finally emerged into the sunlight he hadn't seen in ages. He wasn't the only survivor in the world. In the bustling yet desolate streets of New York City, a man named Larry and his new girlfriend walked down the empty roads. Suddenly, they encountered a sharply dressed man carrying a briefcase. The man offered Larry the money in the case if Larry would lend him his girlfriend for 2 minutes. Furious, Larry flatly refused, believing the man was so quick and showed no respect to his girlfriend. But the man wasn't alone. He had 2 accomplices with him. Realizing the danger, Larry grabbed his girlfriend's hand and bolted like riding a Tesla bike. However, all the shops were shuttered, leaving no place to hide. The couple eventually ducked into a nearby sewer, only to be overwhelmed by the stench and disoriented by the maze of tunnels. To make matters worse, they stumbled upon a nest of rats. Larry's girlfriend, unable to bear it any longer, declared that she'd rather be caught by the thugs who wanted to have a baby with her than stay another minute in the sewer. Larry begged her to reconsider, but she ignored his smelly bullshit, climbing out of the sewer and leaving him behind. Larry, left in despair, knew all too well the brutality of humanity in such chaotic times. He pulled out his phone to navigate his way forward. As the sewer waters rose, Larry hesitated, debating whether to turn back. Suddenly, he spotted a body floating on the surface. To his horror, it was his mother. The scene flashbacks to a couple of weeks earlier. Larry, a budding singer, had been performing at a bar when he received a call from his mother, saying she had fallen gravely ill and was being rushed to the hospital. Upon arriving, he found the hospital overwhelmed with patients. In desperation, he took his mother home to care for her, unaware that a deadly virus was about to unleash itself upon the world. Shortly after, his mother vanished without a trace. In a dream, Larry found himself performing for a cheering crowd amidst the ruins of a city. A bearded man appeared out of nowhere to flex his beard, only to transform into a beardless old woman as Larry woke up in a panic. Around him, the once vibrant city was now eerily silent. Soon, he encountered a fellow survivor emerging from the woods. The man said that the post-apocalyptic world wasn't so bad because people could do whatever they wanted. Larry ignored his bullshit, continuing down a path in the park. To his surprise, he came across another survivor, a blonde lady. She said it had been ages since she'd seen a normal person, and the two quickly bonded, deciding to team up and search for the rumored survivor camp. However, before they could leave the city, Larry was confronted by his long-lost mother. Seeing her disheveled and broken state, he turned and fled in fear. As he climbed out of the sewer, he ran into the blonde lady again, completing a full circle. Together, they resolved to cross the nearby bridge, knowing that once they did, they'd finally escape the city's boundaries. Meanwhile, in the town of Texas, another survivor named Harold grinned at his reflection in the mirror. Before the outbreak, Harold had been relentlessly bullied by his peers. Now, waking up to find the entire town dead, he felt no sadness, only a strange thrill. During one of his free shopping sprees on the abandoned streets, he stumbled upon a police-issued pistol. With a devilish grin, he made his way to his longtime crush Franny's house, only to find that she too was immune to the virus. Excited by this discovery, Harold proposed that they become sex partners, the only two people left in the town. However, Franny, still grieving the recent loss of her father, was disgusted by Harold's suggestion. Her father had succumbed to the virus just days ago, and Franny had buried him in the backyard with great difficulty. Overwhelmed by her grief, she wanted nothing to do with Harold. That night, Franny had a vivid dream of a cornfield, where an elder told her they had met before at a nursing house in Atlanta. Meanwhile, Harold was busy drawing on the map, and he decided to bring Franny out of this town. The next morning, Harold dressed sharply and returned to Franny's house. Hearing water running upstairs, he broke down the bathroom door and found Franny unconscious, having overdosed on sleeping pills. Acting quickly, Harold saved her life, then convinced her not to give up. He shared his grand plan to travel to Atlanta's CDC headquarters, where the advanced facilities might use their antibodies to develop a vaccine. Moved by his determination and reminded of the elderly person from her dream, Franny agreed to go with him. Together, they left messages on the city's walls, urging any survivors to head to Atlanta, and then set off on a Tesla motorcycle to begin their journey. What they didn't know was that not far away, a prison held an inmate named Lloyd. After the virus outbreak, he became the only survivor in the entire facility. Having gone 2 days without food, Lloyd set his sights on catching rats, but his limited mobility made it nearly impossible. Eventually, he turned to his cellmate's corpse for sustenance. Who knows how long this went on before he was startled awake by a bearded man calling his name. Seeing the remains of the cellmate's mangled leg, the man asked if he had done all this. Lloyd admitted it, saying his cellmate deserved it. The scene flashes back to several weeks earlier when Lloyd and his friend planned to rob a store, but his friend accidentally discharged the gun, killing a customer. Deciding there was no turning back, his friend pressured Lloyd to eliminate the shopkeeper as well. As Lloyd hesitated, a police officer happened to walk in, sparking a shootout that left Lloyd unable to clear his name. Both he and his friend were sentenced to prison. Yet just days into his sentence, an unknown virus swept through the prison, leaving Lloyd as the sole survivor. He thought his end was near until the bearded man seemingly appeared out of nowhere, bringing a glimmer of hope. Especially when the man pulled out a key to their cells, Lloyd immediately pledged to do anything the man asked of him. As he stepped out of his cell, the key in his hand transformed into a glowing red stone. So far, the deadly virus has spread across the world, wiping out 99% of humanity. The few survivors, as if guided by an unseen force, began making their way toward Atlanta. Franny and Harold were refueling their motorcycle near the border when they encountered another survivor. It's Stu, the antibody carrier who had recently escaped the military base. Guided by the markings Franny and Harold had left behind, Stu tracked them down. Harold, naturally suspicious, refused Stu's request to travel together, fearing he might have ulterior motives toward Franny, a rare resource in the apocalypse. Franny, exasperated by Harold's paranoia, declared she was going to Atlanta's CDC regardless, only for Stu to inform her that the CDC had already fallen. Parting ways, Stu continued his aimless journey until he met another survivor, Glenn, an artist who had been living in seclusion in the woods. Overjoyed to see another human, Glenn treated Stu to good food and drink, explaining that he had resigned himself to a solitary life in his cabin. That is, until Stu noticed a painting on Glenn's wall depicting a white-haired elder, the very figure Stu had seen in his dreams. Glenn was shocked, insisting it was impossible since the painting was based on his own dream. The two men exchanged stories rather than their hormones, realizing they had been guided by the same figure to a monastery in Atlanta. While sorting through the paintings, Stu was startled to see one of Franny, now visibly pregnant. Having just met her the day before when she was definitely not expecting, both Stu and Glenn were baffled by the situation. Determined to find the elder, Stu and Glenn decided to head to Atlanta immediately, unaware that Franny and Harold were being stopped on the road by a truck. Planning to leave a marker on the vehicle, the pair were caught off guard when a gunman appeared, forcing them into handcuffs before opening the truck's cargo hold. Inside, they found two sexy women being held captive. The gunman pulled Franny toward him, stating it had been far too long since he had encountered a healthy, handsome man. So he offered Harold a grim deal: defeat him in combat, and Harold could take the sexy women and leave. Harold, however, was too cowardly to even put up a fight using his chicken muscles, cowering in fear despite Franny's pleading eyes. Just as Franny was about to be assaulted, a car suddenly sped toward them. The gunman turned to fire, giving one of the captive women the chance to strike, though she was quickly shot down. The second captive seized a metal rod and swung it at the gunman with all her strength, covering Harold in a spray of diabetic blood as he lay trembling on the ground. At that moment, two figures stepped out of the small car across the way. It was Stu and Glenn, who had been searching for Franny by tracing her smell. Each person shared their wet dream experiences, and without exception, they had all encountered the white-haired elder. Though they found it incredible, they unanimously decided to head to the monastery to meet this mysterious figure. Late that night, Franny approached Stu during his watch, confessing that she was, in fact, pregnant. She explained that she had been engaged before the virus outbreak, but her fiancé had succumbed to the infection. Hearing this, Stu suddenly understood why Glenn's dream depicted Franny with a rounded belly, and he became even more eager to meet the mysterious elder. Meanwhile, another survivor, Larry, was also making his way toward Atlanta. He and his newly acquainted companion had just left the city when a sudden downpour forced them to take shelter under a bridge. After enduring the hardships of the day, the blonde lady reflected on the post-apocalyptic world, remarking that even if one managed to survive, the happiness of the past could never be recovered. Rejecting Larry's invitation to continue the journey together, she decided to end her blonde life to escape the boredom and hopelessness of existence. Larry, not attempting to dissuade her, shouldered his pack and continued onward without a hormone yoga session. Along the way, he was suddenly approached by a boy rushing toward him, followed closely by a young woman named Nadine, who hastily explained that the boy suffered from severe autism and that she had come across him only a few days ago. Noticing how much Nadine resembled the blonde woman he had just parted ways with, Larry invited her to join him on his journey. Along the way, they encountered numerous markers left behind by Harold, and Larry decided to take a chance on heading to Atlanta. The three traveled slowly, often stopping for half a day at supermarkets to restock on supplies, gradually gathering a small group of other survivors along the way. However, Larry couldn't help but wonder why Nadine was often seen staring at a pendant. Its design bore an uncanny resemblance to the pendant given to the convict by the mysterious bearded man. After replenishing their supplies, Larry led the group toward their destination, finally arriving at the monastery before nightfall. To his surprise, they were greeted by none other than Stu and his companions, who had arrived earlier. Stu recognized Larry's name, explaining that everyone here had been summoned by the white-haired elder through their dreams. According to Stu, before anyone had arrived, the elder had compiled a list of 5 names, tasking them with managing the survivor camp. Before long, Larry's vehicle pulled up at the entrance to the community, where a large group of survivors had already gathered, their faces radiating relief and freedom. Inside, the residents referred to the white-haired elder as the Saint, believing she held the key to guiding them through this crisis. After escorting Larry to the Saint's residence, Stu offered him a few words of advice before leaving. In the main hall, Larry was greeted by a one-eyed man who was both mute and deaf. This man served as the Saint's spokesperson, though no one knew the specifics of their conversation. Afterward, Larry and Nadine were led to a spacious room that was to be their new home in the monastery community. Curious about what the Saint had told Larry, Nadine asked him about it, but he replied that it was a secret. He then went to visit Harold, expressing his gratitude for the road markers Harold had left behind, without which he might never have made it here. When Larry mentioned his desire to meet Franny, Harold revealed that she didn't live there. At that moment, Franny was showing Nadine around the community's infrastructure. Observing the clean and orderly streets, Nadine marveled at how this sanctuary was like a dream come true in the midst of a virus-stricken apocalypse. The following morning, Larry accompanied Stu on a hunting trip into the woods, as hunting was the community's main food source. While they were out, a car suddenly pulled up in front of them, and a frail man tumbled out, his hands bearing wounds resembling crucifixion marks. As they moved to assist him, the man regained consciousness, claiming he was there to deliver a message. Initially dismissing it as delirium, Stu and Larry carried him to the community's medical center. At that moment, the Saint's spokesperson arrived, producing a slip of paper with the man's words written on it. Stu was taken aback, wondering if it could be that the Saint had foreseen this man's arrival. Yet the severity of the man's injuries suggested he had endured inhuman torture. The spokesperson's mind wandered back to his tragic past. While working at a bar, he was frequently bullied by customers, one of whom, a bully wearing a ring, beat him so badly that he ended up in the hospital. During his coma, he often dreamed of the mysterious bearded man named Randall, who tried to recruit him, promising to restore his hearing and speech. But the spokesperson firmly refused, sensing the darkness and malice in Randall's heart. Enraged, Randall vowed that the spokesperson would pay the price. When the spokesperson awoke in the hospital, his right eye was permanently blind. Yet, the hospital was already void of life. An unknown virus had begun to ravage the population. Hearing sobs from the adjacent room, he discovered it was the very bully who had assaulted him. To his surprise, instead of seeking revenge, the spokesperson helped wipe the yellow fluid from the man's body. When he slept again, Randall didn't appear in his dreams anymore. Instead, he met the kind and gentle Saint, who claimed to be chosen by a divine force. She encouraged him to try speaking in the dream, where he found he could do anything. The Saint revealed that she needed his help to convey divine messages, as this was the only way to lead humanity out of its current plight. The spokesperson snapped back to the present. The Saint had gathered her 5 appointed leaders, now all present in the monastery. Besides the one-eyed spokesperson, the group included Stu, Larry, Franny, and Glenn. While they were still wondering why the Saint had chosen them, she entered the infirmary, where the injured man lay unconscious. As she touched his arm, the man woke up, instantly regaining consciousness. When he saw the Saint, he revealed that he came from a terrible place ruled by Randall. This tyrant had promised to lead his people to a better life, but instead filled their community with criminals and violence. Realizing the danger, the man tried to flee but was soon captured. He described being crucified for days until Randall pardoned him and sent him to deliver a message. However, as he began to speak, blood started seeping from his limbs, and a swarm of crows smashed against the windows. Suddenly, the man's demeanor changed, and he began muttering that they would all die here. When the voice faded, the man drew his last breath. It became clear that the Saint and Randall represented opposing forces in this post-apocalyptic world, one of hope and the other of destruction. Both relied on dreams to recruit followers, and it was likely that the viral plague was Randall's doing. The guard who had escaped the lab had only done so because Randall had held the gate open, enabling the virus's rapid spread. Of course, his methods went far beyond that. Meanwhile, Nadine, who had arrived at the community with Larry, stood before a mirror, lost in thought. Memories of a strange experience from over a decade ago resurfaced. One night, out of boredom, she had played a spirit board game with friends, only for the pencil to move uncontrollably. Terrified, her friends fled in panic, leaving Nadine staring at the single word scrawled on the board: "Nadine will be my queen." From that day forward, a mysterious pendant appeared around her neck. Now, as she admired her tall and slender figure in the mirror, a hint of pride welled up in her heart. That night, Nadine once again used the spirit board, and before she knew it, she found herself in a dark, void-like space. Randall was already waiting for her. He gave her a chilling command: to kill the saint and the 5 appointed leaders. Nadine declared she couldn't do it, but Randall assured her she would have help when the time came. Following the hints from the dream, Nadine sought out Harold, a reclusive and bitter man, as his resentment ran the deepest in the entire community. Harold had once managed to secure a chance to travel with his crush, Franny, but his cowardly behavior during the journey led to Franny falling for Stu instead, someone she had only met a few times. Before long, Franny and Stu became a couple. Outwardly, Harold pretended to be indifferent, but privately he was so angry he nearly ground his teeth to dust. What made it worse was that upon arriving at the camp, both Stu and Franny were immediately appointed as leaders by the saint. Harold, however, was assigned the task of corpse disposal, a role justified by his prior experience on a body cleanup crew in his hometown. The only silver lining was that he reunited with his old colleague Teddy, whom he had always gotten along with. The two resumed working together in the new community. Harold, who had no ambitions to begin with, initially planned to coast through life in idleness until Nadine visited him late one night. Harold, inexperienced and easily swayed, quickly fell for her charms. When Nadine mentioned a plan to eliminate the camp's leaders, Harold immediately agreed since it perfectly aligned with his own grudges. The 5 leaders appointed by the saint were unaware that a traitor lurked among the community. They gathered all the residents in the assembly hall for the camp's first meeting since its establishment. Initially, the crowd was uncooperative, but things changed when Larry stepped up. He praised each role in the community for its contributions, and within a few sentences, he won the crowd over. As the representative leader, Stu then announced an important decision. Since the camp had successfully cleared all the corpses, the cleanup crew would now be restructured into a security patrol. This move would greatly enhance the safety of the community. And just like that, Harold and Teddy donned the patrol uniform. Though it was second-hand gear from a ski club, it immediately gave them a sense of authority. While on patrol, Harold spotted Stu checking in with the patrol members one by one. Harold was twisted with jealousy. As his hand reached into his pocket, he accidentally touched a flyer that contained instructions prohibiting climbers from carrying flammable or explosive items on the mountain. He suddenly came up with a sinister idea of how to sabotage the community. The ski club, dedicated to ensuring the safety of climbers, surely had a supply of explosives used to trigger controlled avalanches. Harold shared his idea with Nadine. They would locate these explosives and use them to level the monastery and destroy the camp entirely. He thought this would be far more satisfying than merely eliminating the leaders. When the two pried open the warehouse and were about to clear out the shelves of explosives, they were unexpectedly caught by Teddy, who happened to be patrolling the area. Seeing Harold step out of the building, Teddy immediately let his guard down. But in a sudden turn of events, Nadine pulled out a gun and shot Teddy, sending him to meet his maker. Even Harold, as bitter as he was, couldn't help but feel grief over his friend's tragic death. Nadine explained that it was a necessary action. If anyone discovered their plans to steal the explosives, their destruction scheme would be completely exposed. The next morning, Teddy's body was found in the center of the square. When Harold received the news, he rushed to the scene, pretending to shed a few tears and vowing to catch the killer. Meanwhile, the camp leaders recalled the strange warnings from a mysterious man a few days prior and concluded that an enemy force had begun its operations. It seemed that merely setting up a security patrol was too passive. They needed to figure out the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. After some discussion, they decided to send 3 undercover agents to infiltrate the enemy forces. Stu initially volunteered to infiltrate the enemy camp himself, but was quickly rejected. The community needed him for leadership, and his public visibility made him an unsuitable candidate. Franny was the first to recommend someone: Dana, a woman known for her beauty and fierce temperament. Dana had once killed a robber with her bare hands, so her courage and determination were beyond doubt. For the second infiltrator, the group chose an inconspicuous older woman named Harris. Though quiet and unassuming, she had a sharp mind and a calm demeanor. Most of the community residents had been handpicked by the saint herself, and their loyalty to the camp was strong. Despite the daunting mission, the two women accepted their roles without hesitation. When it came to choosing the third infiltrator, the group was torn. Breaking the silence, the spokesperson suggested Tom, a large and simple-minded man he had met at the hospital during the early days of the virus outbreak. Although Tom had a low IQ, he was honest, dependable, and a loyal companion. He was also one of the first survivors to arrive at the monastery, earning high praise from the saint. Though Tom's intelligence limited him to following simple instructions, Glenn devised a cover story for him. Once inside the enemy camp, he would observe quietly and say nothing, returning only after the full moon. And so, the three infiltrators were chosen. The leaders discreetly bid them farewell, their faces heavy with concern. It was clear that this was a journey from which not all might return. The five leaders believed their infiltration plan had been well concealed, but the saint was immediately aware of it. Furious, she scolded the spokesperson, warning that it wasn't the right time to provoke the enemy. Such actions might lead to severe retaliation, and Teddy's death could very well have been only the beginning. Distraught, the saint prayed for guidance, but her concentration was broken by the growl of a wolf. Unbeknownst to her, Harold had just been calmed by Nadine after his restless mind began to spiral. As Harold stepped outside, he bumped into Franny, his longtime crush, who was unusually warm and inviting, much to his surprise. She even asked him to dinner at her place that evening. Harold, overjoyed, couldn't believe his luck, thinking that Franny might have finally changed her mind. However, Franny had other plans. She quickly found Larry and asked for his help in searching Harold's house while she distracted him. Franny, who had grown up with Harold in the same small town, knew his petty and vengeful nature all too well. She suspected he might do something drastic in response to Teddy's death. Larry agreed without hesitation, sharing her concerns about Harold's recent odd behavior. That night, Harold arrived at Franny's house, bouquet and wine in hand, only to find Stu already there. Though annoyed, he restrained himself and joined them at the table. Meanwhile, Franny discreetly used her walkie-talkie to signal Larry to begin his search. Larry had been waiting patiently. Armed with a flashlight, he quietly slipped into Harold's house. Finding the door to the basement locked, he didn't dare force it open, opting instead to search the living room and bedrooms. Meanwhile, after a few drinks, Harold excused himself under the pretense of needing the bathroom, but instead wandered into Franny's bedroom. Seeing a stuffed bear on her desk, he smiled wistfully. Returning to the dining room, Harold claimed he was feeling tipsy and needed to head home early. At that moment, Larry, still inside Harold's house, stumbled upon clothes belonging to Nadine. Before he could process this, Franny's voice came through on the walkie-talkie. Harold was on his way back. Hastily tidying up and leaving through the back door, Larry narrowly avoided Harold, who immediately noticed something was amiss. His chessboard had been disturbed, and he quickly realized someone had been in his home. What neither Franny nor Stu realized was that Harold had secretly installed cameras in Franny's house. He had watched their every move, and the footage also revealed Larry's earlier search of his home, captured in full detail. Just as this was unfolding, Stu received devastating news, which said that the saint had left the community, leaving behind only a note urging them not to look for her. Panic spread among the leaders, causing them to wonder if the saint had abandoned them or if she was on an important mission. Fortunately, they had already dispatched the three infiltrators, and it was only a matter of time before intelligence would return. Meanwhile, Dana, one of the infiltrators, finally reached the enemy camp's base. To her astonishment, they had transformed Las Vegas into a new city of freedom. Here, there were no laws, no restrictions, and residents lived as they pleased. With her striking presence, Dana quickly caught the attention of Lloyd, the second in command and the first follower Randall had freed from prison. As the City of Freedom flourished, Lloyd's influence and status grew. Dana, by accompanying Lloyd to high-profile events, finally earned the opportunity to meet the ruler Randall, and in the City of Freedom, he was worshipped as a god. Dana averted her terrified gaze from the dueling arena and was shocked to spot a familiar figure. It was Tom, another infiltrator. He had arrived at the City of Freedom a bit later than her, but had managed to integrate himself by flawlessly reciting his cover story. Unfortunately, his job was particularly gruesome, cleaning up the dismembered remains in the arena after duels. That night, Dana used the excuse of losing something to seek him out. As she slipped him a warning note, she urged him to get away immediately. Soon after, Dana received a summons from Lloyd, who informed her that the supreme leader, Randall, wanted to see her. Curious about why someone so powerful would bother with a minor figure like her, Dana reluctantly went. To her horror, Randall had already uncovered her true identity as an infiltrator, and he even knew her entire past. Another infiltrator, Harris, had been exposed days earlier and disappeared into the desert without a trace. Randall promised to let Dana go if she revealed the identity of the third infiltrator. Dana quickly realized that Randall's inability to manipulate Tom's dreams likely stemmed from Tom's intellectual simplicity. Accepting that she wouldn't survive, Dana defiantly picked up a pair of scissors and stabbed Randall in the neck. To her shock, Randall collapsed but immediately rose again as though nothing had happened. Frustrated by her silence, Randall declared that he would use stronger measures. Sensing no way out, Dana grabbed a glass bottle and slashed her own throat. Meanwhile, the survivors at the camp remained oblivious to the looming danger. Instead, they were focused on searching for the saint who had disappeared overnight. Despite their best efforts, after a day and a night, most grew despondent, doubting that a centenarian could survive alone in the wilderness. Questions about why the saint would leave at all gnawed at their minds. Unbeknownst to them, this was all part of Randall's trap. He had long ordered Nadine and Harold to prepare explosives to destroy the camp. Fearing the saint might foresee and thwart his plans, he had conjured the illusion of a wolf disguised as a divine message to lure her away. The saint, seeking to uncover the will of the divine, followed the wolf straight into Randall's trap. Upon seeing Randall's spectral form, the saint realized she had been deceived. As she tried to escape the dreamscape and return to the camp, Randall unleashed a murder of crows to knock her into a mountain ravine. With the saint gone, traitors Nadine and Harold finally had free rein to act. Learning that the residents planned to gather at the saint's home the next day for a prayer ceremony, the pair were ecstatic. Nadine, as a community teacher, had unrestricted access to the saint's quarters, where she had already rigged the room with explosives. That evening, Harold entered the room and reminded Stu to continue searching for the saint. Seeing Harold's cold demeanor and his glance toward the explosives, Franny grew suspicious. Deciding to investigate further, she snuck into Harold's house and broke into the basement that Larry had previously failed to search. Descending the stairs, she found monitors displaying footage of her own bedroom. A chill ran down her spine to her smelly butt. Exploring further, she discovered a workbench laden with detonators and explosives, along with a notebook filled with Harold's plans to destroy the camp. Just as she began to process what she had found, the door suddenly swung open. Its Harold had returned early. Confronting Franny, Harold accused her of intruding and berated her for never accepting him. He lamented how he had endured so much, waiting until the muscular men in their hometown were all gone, yet Franny still refused to choose him. In a fit of rage, Harold declared his intention to eliminate everyone in the camp, leaving Franny with no other option but to be with him. Franny, horrified, tried to reason with him, reminding him that they understood each other better than anyone. But Harold refused to listen. He shoved Franny aside, locked her in the basement, and stormed out, claiming he had something important to accomplish. Once done, he believed Franny would finally see him in a new light. Meanwhile, Larry was preparing to attend the saint's prayer ceremony. Nadine, her expression evasive, suggested he stay home, warning him against leaving. However, as the ceremony's host, Larry insisted on attending. Nadine didn't press further and left with her younger brother in tow. Sensing something was off, Larry decided to alert Stu, only to discover that his walkie-talkie's circuits had been damaged. Attempting to ride his motorcycle to the ceremony, he found the bike sabotaged as well. Meanwhile, Nadine had entrusted her younger brother to the care of a preschool teacher, knowing the children were too young to attend the prayer ceremony. After setting everything in motion, Nadine and Harold arrived at the agreed meeting spot. Their plan was simple. As soon as the prayer ceremony began, they would detonate the explosives they had planted in advance. What they didn't know, however, was that Franny had shattered the ventilation glass in the workroom and escaped from the basement. Meanwhile, Nadine's younger brother, who had been watching TV, suddenly heard a faint voice calling him. Following the sound, he wandered into the woods and stumbled upon the unconscious saint lying on the ground. Shortly after, the patrol team reported the saint's location to Stu, who immediately canceled the prayer ceremony and instructed everyone to visit the saint at the hospital. At that moment, Franny burst in, urging everyone to evacuate immediately. Meanwhile, the spokesperson, who was preparing to leave for the hospital, noticed that the piano in the hall was filled with explosives. In the next instant, Nadine and Harold pressed the detonator. Flames shot into the sky, confirming their plan's success. Harold turned to Nadine and said it's time for them to leave. Far away in the City of Freedom, Randall seemed to sense that something had gone wrong. He concluded that the explosion at the monastery camp had not achieved the desired results and decided to execute a backup plan. He ordered his deputy to capture the escaped infiltrator, Harris, hoping to extract information about the third infiltrator from her. Within just 2 days, the bounty hunters of the City of Freedom completed the mission, but they brought back Harris's lifeless body instead of a living captive. Randall, seething with rage, cast a cold glare at the bounty hunter and warned him he had 1 minute to leave. Sensing Randall's killing intent, the bounty hunter broke into a cold sweat and hurried toward the elevator. But just as the doors closed, Randall inexplicably appeared inside. Accompanied by blood-curdling screams, the bounty hunter met his end before the horrified eyes of onlookers. This was the first time Randall had lost composure in front of his followers, a sign that he was unraveling due to his failure to locate the final infiltrator. Consumed by paranoia, Randall grew increasingly desperate. With Harris dead, he decided to take extreme measures, ordering his men to round up all recently admitted residents. Unbeknownst to him, the true infiltrator, Tom, had already followed Dana's advice and smuggled himself out of the city inside a corpse transport truck. While Randall gained no new leads, he sought reinforcements through the dream realm, recruiting an arsonist whose mind had been damaged by years of playing with fire. Captivated by Randall's extraordinary abilities, the arsonist began to worship him as a deity. Randall's voice, filled with allure and menace, instructed the arsonist to retrieve the most powerful fire, the nuclear warheads located in a desert testing facility. Clearly deranged, Randall planned to use the nukes to obliterate the monastery camp entirely. Meanwhile, the leaders at the camp had successfully extinguished the flames caused by the explosion. Fortunately, the prayer ceremony had been canceled just in time, minimizing casualties. However, the saint's spokesperson had been at the epicenter of the blast, leaving only fragmented remains for burial. At that moment, the saint regained consciousness in her hospital bed and summoned the leaders. Stu and the others rushed to her side, bringing even the injured Franny in a wheelchair. Weak and frail, the saint admitted to grave mistakes and warned that the growing darkness needed to be stopped immediately. She instructed all but Franny to embark westward on foot at dawn, cautioning that one of them would not reach the destination. With those words, she closed her eyes forever. Meanwhile, Nadine and Harold were riding their motorcycle toward the City of Freedom. On a mountain road, Nadine suddenly sped up. Confused, Harold chased after her, trying to ask what was going on. Distracted, he failed to notice the sharp turn ahead and plunged into a ravine. A branch pierced his chest, leaving him immobile. Still clinging to hope, Harold believed Nadine would come to save him, but she merely glanced down at him before riding away. Only then did Harold realize he had been used. With his final breaths, he scrawled down everything he knew about the City of Freedom. He died in despair and regret. Back at the monastery camp, the remaining leaders began their journey toward the City of Freedom on foot, following the saint's instructions. They deliberately avoided using any form of transportation. The destination lay over 1,000 kilometers away, and it was uncertain when or if they would arrive. That day, as they passed Harold's accident site, Larry looked at the rotting corpse with pity and decided to give him a proper burial. While doing so, he stumbled upon Harold's final notebook and finally understood how Randall manipulated minds. Nadine had once inadvertently mentioned that the more people worshipped Randall, the stronger his power became. This realization weighed heavily on the group as they continued on their journey. A deep trench suddenly blocked their path, stretching endlessly in both directions. Their only choice was to cross it. Stu jumped down first and confirmed it was safe before the others followed. But as they climbed toward the other side, the heavy concrete above them suddenly collapsed. Stu fell hard to the bottom of the trench. Though his life wasn't in danger, his right leg was severely fractured. The group did their best to treat his injury, but it was clear Stu couldn't continue. Remembering the saint's prophecy that one of them wouldn't make it to the destination, Stu urged the others to press on without him. The group hesitated, their hearts heavy with guilt. The area was desolate, and Stu couldn't possibly last long on his own. Glenn handed him a box of painkillers, reminding him to take one every 12 hours, before cryptically adding that taking 3 or 4 at once might be fatal. It was his subtle way of suggesting that Stu might face something worse than death if left alone. After a reluctant farewell, Larry and the others pressed forward. They hadn't gone far when a luxury car suddenly pulled up in front of them. Stepping out was Lloyd, the second in command of the City of Freedom. It seemed Randall had anticipated their arrival, and now they were at his mercy. Meanwhile, in the desert military base, the pyromaniac Randall had sent out actually discovered a warhead. His face lit with excitement as he prepared to return and report to his leader. The radiation gauge on his equipment was nearly maxed out, a chilling testament to the weapon's destructive power. Amidst the worsening chaos, the survivors faced yet another disaster, a lightning strike. At the same time, the only grand city left in the post-apocalyptic world was on the brink of annihilation. The scene then flashes back to 2 nights earlier when Larry and his group of 3 were brought into the legendary City of Freedom. They marveled at the clean, orderly streets, but were shocked to see public beatings of captured escapees every few blocks. Before long, they arrived at the grand headquarters of the city's leaders, only to be greeted by an unexpected figure, Nadine. In just a few days, she had grown gaunt, though her belly was noticeably swollen. Larry and the others fared no better, quickly thrown into cages as prisoners. Randall, the city's ruler, wanted to showcase the superiority of his regime by holding a public trial for the 3 criminals from the monastery camp. Lloyd confidently declared that if they admitted their camp was a savage wasteland and agreed to join the City of Freedom, they would be set free. Glenn immediately rebuked Lloyd, arguing that even after only a day in the city, he could see that its residents lived under Randall's oppressive rule. Addressing a camera, he challenged Randall to confront him directly. Furious, Lloyd struck Glenn to the ground. Glenn, undeterred, asked if he was just as controlled by fear as everyone else. Perhaps hitting a nerve, Lloyd impulsively pulled the trigger on his gun, killing Glenn on the spot. The crowd gasped, some residents beginning to question Glenn's words. From afar, Randall, who had been observing the trial, suddenly staggered and fell from his perch. Harold's notebook had mentioned that Randall's power was directly tied to the faith of his followers. With his reputation shaken, Randall's strength was also weakened. It turned out that Stu and the others had anticipated this, and Glenn's sacrifice had not been in vain. Back in the wilderness, Stu was left behind with a broken leg, believing he was doomed. But to his surprise, their loyal dog had left the group to stay by his side and protect him. Through the cold, lonely nights, Stu repeatedly considered ending his life, only to be stopped by the dog's soft whimpering. Like a steadfast guardian, the dog drove away any approaching predators, allowing Stu to survive against all odds. In the City of Freedom, Larry and the Saint's assistant were still deliberating their next move when Nadine suddenly burst in with her followers. She dismissed everyone else, leaving only Larry in the room. Staring directly at him, she demanded to know what happened to her little brother. Larry shook his head, telling her to worry about herself instead. After all, in just a few days, she had become unrecognizable. Nadine, confused, retorted that she was doing great. Ever since arriving in the City of Freedom, Randall had made her his queen, and her life had been nothing short of luxurious. Larry handed her a tray, urging her to take a closer look at herself. At that moment, Nadine's face fell. Though she had recently examined herself in the elevator and her bedroom mirror, she couldn't help but wonder if everything she'd seen was just an illusion. Suddenly, sharp pain coursed through her abdomen, suggesting that it was time to give birth. At the maternity ward, Nadine bore the pain and demanded to know what kind of monster she was about to deliver, and she could feel her life force draining away. Randall coldly explained that she was giving birth to the Prince of the City of Freedom, fulfilling her purpose. At last, Nadine realized that the promise Randall made to her years ago, "She is his queen," had been nothing more than a lie. She was nothing but a tool to him. With newfound clarity, Nadine broke the glass of her pendant and leapt from the building without hesitation. Randall roared like a goose in fury. The prince he had pinned all his hopes on was gone before even taking his first breath. Lloyd, Randall's second-in-command, felt the brunt of his leader's wrath. Overwhelmed with fear, he scrambled to make amends, playing on Randall's emotions by reminding him that he was the first to pledge loyalty. Randall appeared calm, but his instructions were cruel. Lloyd was ordered to present Nadine's severed head to Larry, whom Randall deemed responsible for her death. Planning a public execution, Randall announced to the citizens that these outsiders would pay with their lives. His rousing speech reignited the crowd's fervor, and the dwindling admiration for Randall seemed to recover slightly. Randall then declared his intent to eradicate the monastery camp, likening it to a dark abyss, and revealed his plan to obliterate it with a nuclear warhead. Meanwhile, a live video feed showed the pyromaniac successfully returning to the city with the warhead. As the tank containing Larry began to fill with water, the crowd's cheers grew louder. Lloyd, attempting to curry favor, approached Larry to taunt him, but Larry, undaunted, defiantly declared that he feared no evil. Feeling insulted, Lloyd began beating him with a rod, but Larry's words continued to resonate. Finally, one brave soul in the crowd shouted he feared no evil either. Randall, enraged, immediately ordered the dissenters' execution. Yet, one after another, more people stood up in defiance. The situation spiraled out of Randall's control. At that moment, the pyromaniac arrived at the assembly with the warhead. His body was ravaged by radiation, his face barely human, but he persevered to complete his mission. However, to the onlookers, Randall's disregard for his followers' lives was becoming increasingly apparent. The people's adoration for him began to turn into hatred, and Randall started to suffer the consequences. Suddenly, dark clouds gathered over the city, and the entire building was shrouded in smoke. Lightning strikes rained down, targeting Randall's closest allies. Lloyd tried to flee but was crushed by a falling lamppost. Randall stood frozen, watching as bolts of lightning converged into a massive thunderball. In the eerie glow, he saw the shadow of the saint smiling at him before he was struck down, reduced to ash in an instant. But it wasn't over yet. Several bolts of lightning struck the warhead, causing it to detonate. A massive mushroom cloud rose over the city, visible from miles away. In the wilderness, Stu was jolted awake by the blinding light on the horizon. Moments later, a powerful shockwave swept over him. Through the smoke and dust, a familiar figure emerged. It was Tom, the infiltrator who had escaped earlier. The City of Freedom, the last great stronghold of humanity, was no more. Now, the only surviving community was the monastery camp where Franny resided. A few weeks later, Franny's baby was born, but their joy was short-lived. The infant's neck began to swell. It was infected with the virus. Franny fell into despair, certain her child would not survive. Yet against all odds, the baby recovered on its own. This was humanity's first victory against the virus using natural immunity. Unlike the antibody carriers before, this new generation was born immune and never contracted the disease. Humanity's hope for survival was rekindled. To Franny's delight, Stu, battered but alive, returned to the camp. Unfortunately, the other leaders had perished in the nuclear blast. Perhaps the saint had foreseen all of this and sent them to the City of Freedom, ensuring that Stu alone would survive to carry on her legacy. Under Franny and Stu's management, the monastery community thrived. One day, Franny decided it was time to see more of the world. Stu, unwilling to let her take risks alone, joined her along with the baby. They set off in their RV, crossing several states without encountering any other survivors. Eventually, they reached a remote farm where their dog began sniffing the cornfield as if it had discovered something. Turning around, they spotted a small hand reaching for a doll on the ground. That night, under a quiet sky, a young girl looked upward and murmured a solemn prayer to the gods. The next morning, Franny noticed that her baby had fallen ill. Stu immediately drove to a nearby store to find medicine, leaving Franny alone at the farm. While fetching water, Franny accidentally fell into a well several meters deep. Dazed, she wandered into a forest in her mind and was shocked to see Randall, who had long been dead. He claimed he had something to show her. To her surprise, hidden within the dense forest was a primitive tribe that had somehow remained untouched by the virus. After telling her that, Randall waved his hands, causing Franny to see a reflection of herself in the water. She saw her real-world self lying at the bottom of the well with multiple broken bones and a rib piercing her lung. Meanwhile, her baby cried from hunger, and Stu's vehicle had broken down, leaving him unable to return in time. Faced with such desperation, Randall urged her to submit to him in exchange for survival. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Franny's resolve remained unshaken. Rejecting Randall's temptation, she struggled to escape the forest. Suddenly, she found herself in a cornfield, drawn by a familiar melody. Following the sound, she was astonished to encounter the saint, who appeared as serene and kind as ever. The saint reassured Franny, telling her she would someday become the mother of 5 children, who would in turn give birth to 20 more, creating a family of 70 that would help repopulate the earth. Meanwhile, back in reality, Stu had managed to repair the RV and rushed back to the farm, where he found the young girl caring for their baby. She calmly informed him that Franny was trapped in the well. Alarmed, Stu quickly lowered a rescue rope and descended to save Franny, who was barely clinging to life. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous. The young girl gently touched Franny's wounds, which instantly healed, allowing Franny to stand and walk as though nothing had happened. Before they could thank her, the girl vanished without an explanation, as if she had never existed. Stu was convinced that she was an incarnation of the saint. The ordeal deepened Franny's understanding of the world. She remarked that everything has 2 sides, light and dark. Just like that dry well, as long as they hold on to themselves, they can eventually reach the light. It seemed her mission was far from over. As if to validate Franny's insight, the Dark Lord Randall somehow resurrected himself within the indigenous tribe hidden in the forest, and so concluded the first season of this post-apocalyptic tale. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.